The committee room fell silent as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stood at the podium, her voice steady and clear as she presented her evidence on voting rights violations. But Texas Senator Ted Cruz had other plans. Within seconds of her opening statement, he interrupted with a sharp point of order. The room turned to watch as Cruz, his signature smirk already forming, prepared to dominate yet another hearing. What happened next would shock everyone in that room. Cruz thought he could steamroll the freshman congresswoman from Texas with his usual tactics. He interrupted her 6 times in the first 10 minutes, each interruption more aggressive than the last. But Crockett had been preparing for this moment her entire career. When Cruz made his 7th attempt to silence her, what came out of her mouth left the entire committee speechless and turned Cruz's own strategy against him in the most devastating way possible. Before we dive into this incredible showdown, hit that like button if you want to see more political moments like this. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the latest congressional drama. Now, let's see how a first-term representative from Texas absolutely destroyed one of the most seasoned politicians in Washington. The hearing was supposed to be routine. The Committee on the Judiciary had gathered to discuss new voting legislation, and Crockett, serving on her first major committee, was presenting research she'd spent months compiling. Her brown suit was pressed perfectly, her notes organized, her voice confident. She'd practiced this presentation dozens of times, but Ted Cruz had been watching from across the room, his arms crossed, that familiar, calculating look in his eyes. The Texas senator had built his entire career on moments like this, finding young Democrats and making examples of them in front of the cameras. At 53, Cruz had earned a reputation as one of the sharpest legal minds in the Senate. Someone who could slice through arguments with surgical precision. Crockett was everything Cruz loved to target, young, passionate, and representing a district that had flipped from red to blue. At 33, she was exactly the kind of progressive voice that Cruz made his living opposing. She'd been a civil rights attorney before winning her seat. But committee hearings were different from courtrooms. This was Cruz's domain. As Crockett began reading her opening statement about voter suppression data, Cruz leaned forward in his chair. He'd done this dance 100 times before. Wait for the perfect moment. Interrupt with a procedural question. Throw the speaker off their rhythm and then dominate the conversation. It was a strategy that had worked against dozens of Democratic representatives over the years. The cameras were rolling. The room was packed with staffers, reporters, and advocacy groups. This was exactly the kind of high-stakes moment that could make or break a political career. Cruz knew it. Crockett knew it. Everyone in that room could feel the tension building. Ted Cruz sat at the committee table like a predator sizing up its prey. His Harvard law degree gleamed in his background. His years as Texas Solicitor General, giving him the kind of courtroom confidence that had intimidated countless witnesses. He'd argued 9 cases before the highest court in the land, written best-selling books, and run for president. In his mind, facing a first-term representative should be easy work. Cruz had built his entire political brand on moments exactly like this one. He was the constitutional conservative who could outbeat anyone, the legal scholar who could find the flaw in any argument, the seasoned politician who knew exactly how to use procedure to control the narrative. His supporters loved watching him dismantle liberal arguments on live television. But what Cruz didn't fully understand was exactly who he was dealing with. Jasmine Crockett hadn't stumbled into Congress by accident. She'd spent years as a civil rights attorney, arguing cases in courtrooms across Texas, defending clients against some of the most powerful legal teams in the state. She'd won cases that everyone said were impossible to win. Crockett had grown up in St. Louis, earned her law degree from the University of Houston, and spent years fighting voter suppression cases long before she ever thought about running for office. She'd faced down hostile judges, aggressive opposing counsel, and courtrooms full of people who underestimated her because of her age and appearance. The stakes in this hearing couldn't be higher. The voting rights legislation they were discussing could affect millions of Americans across the country. But more than that, this was about power. Cruz represented the old guard, the establishment politicians who'd controlled these committees for decades. Crockett represented a new generation of leaders who weren't willing to be silenced or intimidated. The voting rights bill on the table would expand access to early voting, increase poll monitoring, and crack down on voter intimidation tactics. For Cruz, this represented everything he opposed about federal overreach. For Crockett, it was about protecting the fundamental right that democracy depends on. Cruz had already made it clear in pre-hearing interviews that he planned to expose what he called the radical agenda behind the legislation. He'd done his research on Crockett, studied her background, and identified what he thought were weaknesses in her legal arguments. In his mind, this hearing was an opportunity to score political points against the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. But Crockett had done her homework, too. She'd studied Cruz's tactics, watched hours of his previous committee performances, and identified patterns in how he operated. She knew he would try to interrupt, knew he would try to throw her off balance, knew he would try to turn the hearing into a debate about constitutional interpretation rather than the facts of voter suppression. The room was filled with tension as both sides prepared for battle. Cruz's staff had briefed him on potential vulnerabilities in the Democratic arguments. Crockett's team had prepared counter-arguments for every possible line of attack. The media was ready to capture every moment of what promised to be an explosive confrontation. What neither side fully anticipated was how personal this would become and how quickly Cruz's usual tactics would backfire against an opponent who'd spent years preparing for exactly this kind of fight. Crockett had barely finished her first paragraph when Cruz struck. "Point of order, Mr. Chairman," he said, his voice cutting through her presentation like a knife. "I believe the witness is mischaracterizing the legal precedent she's citing." The interruption was classic Cruz, technically within the rules, but clearly designed to throw Crockett off her rhythm. She paused, looked directly at Cruz, and calmly responded. "Senator, if you'd allow me to finish my statement, I believe your concerns will be addressed." But Cruz wasn't done. He leaned into his microphone, that familiar smirk spreading across his face. "With respect, Congresswoman, accuracy matters in these hearings. We can't allow misstatements of law to go uncorrected, even if they support our particular political narrative." The room buzzed with tension. Staffers looked up from their notes. Reporters leaned forward. This was exactly the kind of confrontation that made for viral clips and cable news highlights. Crockett took a breath and continued with her presentation, diving into statistics about polling place closures in Texas. She'd made it through exactly 2 sentences when Cruz interrupted again. "Point of order," Cruz said, his voice more aggressive this time. "The data the Congresswoman is presenting appears to be incomplete. Are we supposed to make policy decisions based on cherry-picked statistics?" This time, murmurs rippled through the room. Even members of Cruz's own party shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Interrupting once could be seen as legitimate oversight. Twice was starting to look like harassment. But Crockett remained calm. "Senator Cruz, I appreciate your interest in the data. I have the complete methodology and sourcing available if you'd like to review it after I finish presenting the evidence." Her composure seemed to frustrate Cruz. He'd expected her to get flustered, to lose her train of thought, to give him an opening to take control of the hearing. Instead, she was handling his interruptions like a seasoned professional. Crockett moved on to discussing voter intimidation tactics, presenting case studies from recent elections. She was hitting her stride, her voice gaining confidence with each point. The evidence she was presenting was damning. Clear patterns of suppression targeting specific communities. That's when Cruz made his third interruption. "Mr. Chairman, I have to object to the characterization of legitimate election security measures as intimidation. This kind of inflammatory language has no place in a serious policy discussion." Now the room was getting uncomfortable. 3 interruptions in 5 minutes was beyond normal committee procedure. Some members were starting to exchange glances. The chairman looked like he was considering stepping in, but Cruz was just getting started. As Crockett tried to present evidence about poll monitoring, he interrupted a 4th time. "Point of order. The Congresswoman seems to be conflating poll watching, which is legal and necessary, with voter intimidation, which is illegal. This distinction matters." Crockett's jaw tightened slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Senator, poll watching is indeed legal. Poll intimidation is not. The evidence I'm presenting clearly distinguishes between the two." The 5th interruption came as Crockett was discussing federal oversight mechanisms. "Mr. Chairman," Cruz said, his voice now dripping with condescension, "I think we need to clarify the constitutional limitations on federal authority here. The Congresswoman seems to be advocating for federal overreach that would violate state sovereignty." By now, the atmosphere in the room had completely changed. What had started as a policy hearing was turning into a personal confrontation. Cruz's interruptions were becoming more frequent and more aggressive. Crockett's supporters in the gallery were visibly frustrated. Even some Republicans looked uncomfortable with Cruz's tactics. But the 6th interruption was the most aggressive. Yet, as Crockett tried to present her concluding recommendations, Cruz slammed his hand on the table. "Point of order. This entire presentation is nothing more than partisan theater designed to justify federal takeover of state election systems. We cannot allow this committee to be used as a platform for radical constitutional revisionism. The room erupted. Democrats demanded order. Republicans looked uncertain. The chairman called for calm, but all eyes were on Crockett, who stood at the podium with her papers in hand. Her expression unreadable. She'd been interrupted 6 times in 10 minutes. Her carefully prepared presentation had been shredded by Cruz's tactical aggression. Any normal witness would have been rattled, confused, thrown completely off balance. The systematic nature of the assault was evident to everyone in the room. Cruz had methodically dismantled every attempt at sustained argument, turning what should have been a policy discussion into a display of his own perceived intellectual dominance. The pattern was so obvious that even neutral observers were beginning to question whether this was legitimate oversight or political bullying disguised as constitutional scrutiny. The physical toll of sustained interruption was visible in the eye. Tension around Crockett's eyes and the slight tightening of her jaw. But what wasn't visible was the mental preparation that had equipped her for exactly this scenario. Her years of courtroom experience had taught her that aggressive opponents often revealed their weaknesses when they became overconfident. Cruz's escalating aggression suggested he was following a predetermined script rather than responding to the actual content of her presentation. The mathematical precision of his interruption pattern, exactly 6 challenges in 10 minutes, revealed the calculated nature of his approach. This wasn't spontaneous constitutional concern. It was choreographed political theater designed to generate viral moments and fundraising opportunities. Crockett recognized the pattern because she'd studied it in preparation for this hearing. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't any normal witness. She was a civil rights attorney who'd spent years dealing with hostile courtrooms. She was a politician who'd won her seat by defeating better-funded opponents. And she was a woman who'd been underestimated her entire career. As the room slowly quieted down, Crockett looked directly at Cruz. She set down her prepared remarks and spoke without notes, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent chamber. "Senator Cruz," she said, her tone perfectly calm. "I can see you're very passionate about this issue. Since you seem to have so many concerns about my presentation, perhaps you'd like to present your own evidence about voting rights in Texas." Cruz smiled that familiar smirk. This was exactly what he'd been waiting for. A chance to take control of the hearing and deliver his own prepared talking points. He began to respond, ready to launch into his 7th interruption of the day. But what happened next would change everything. Cruz opened his mouth to deliver what he thought would be his knockout blow. "Congresswoman, since you mention evidence, let me tell you about the real evidence of voter fraud and election irregularities that justify the security measures you're attacking." But Crockett held up her hand and spoke over him, her voice clear and commanding. "Senator Cruz, with all due respect, you've interrupted me 6 times in the past 10 minutes. I believe it's time you learn what the word respect actually means." The room went dead silent. Cruz's mouth hung open mid-sentence. He'd been interrupted himself, and the shock of it was written all over his face. Crockett continued, her voice gaining strength. "You want to talk about evidence, Senator? Let's talk about evidence. You've mentioned election security 6 different times in your interruptions. So, let me ask you directly. Can you provide this committee with evidence of voter fraud in Texas that would justify the polling place closures I was discussing?" Cruz tried to regain his footing. "Congresswoman, there are documented cases of irregularities that Senator Crockett cut him off again. I asked for evidence, not talking points. Do you have specific data about voter fraud rates in Texas?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Cruz, caught off guard by having his own tactics used against him, stammered for a moment. "Well, the issue is more complex than simple fraud statistics." "So, that's a no," Crockett said calmly. "You don't have evidence of fraud that would justify closing polling locations in predominantly minority communities. You interrupted my presentation 6 times to challenge evidence you haven't even reviewed, while offering no evidence of your own." The room was electric with tension. Staffers were furiously taking notes. Reporters were leaning forward to catch every word. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for without knowing it. But Crockett wasn't finished. She turned to address the full committee, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who'd found her rhythm. "Mr. Chairman, I've spent the last 10 minutes being interrupted by someone who claims to care about accuracy and evidence, but who can't provide any evidence for his own claims. Senator Cruz has made this hearing about his performance rather than the serious issue of voting rights." Cruz tried to interject. "Point of order?" "No," Crockett said firmly, her voice cutting through his attempted interruption. "Senator, you've had your 6 chances to make points of order. Now it's time to listen." The power dynamic in the room had completely shifted. Cruz, who'd controlled the hearing for the first 10 minutes, suddenly found himself on the defensive. His usual tactics, interruption, intimidation, procedural manipulation, had been turned against him by someone who knew exactly how to handle aggressive opponents. Crockett turned back to her notes, but instead of continuing her original presentation, she shifted to a direct response to each of Cruz's interruptions. "Senator Cruz questioned my legal precedent citations. I have the case law right here if he'd like to review it. He questioned my data methodology. I have peer-reviewed studies from 3 different universities. He questioned my characterization of voter intimidation. I have sworn affidavit from affected voters." With each point, she placed documents on the table with a satisfying thud. The visual effect was powerful. Concrete evidence versus empty rhetoric. "But what I don't have," Crockett continued, "is any evidence from Senator Cruz supporting his claims about election fraud or the necessity of the restrictive measures he's defending. What I don't have is any substantive policy alternative from someone who spent more time interrupting than listening." Cruz's face was flushing red. He tried one more time to regain control. "Congresswoman, if you understood constitutional law..." "Senator," Crockett interrupted, her voice sharp as a blade. "I practiced constitutional law before I came to Congress. I argued voting rights cases in federal court while you were writing fundraising emails about them. So, please don't lecture me about constitutional law when you can't even follow basic committee procedure." The room erupted. Democrats were applauding. Republicans sat in stunned silence. Even the chairman looked impressed despite trying to maintain neutrality. But Crockett still had one more devastating blow to deliver. She picked up a thick folder from her table and held it up for everyone to see. "Since Senator Cruz is so concerned about evidence and accuracy, let me share some evidence with this committee. This folder contains voting data from Senator Cruz's own re-election campaign in 2018. It shows that his campaign relied heavily on early voting, mail-in ballots, and extended polling hours. The exact same voting methods he's now claiming are security risks." She opened the folder and began reading specific numbers. Senator Cruz received 287,000 early votes in Harris County alone. His campaign sent mail-in ballot applications to senior communities across Texas. His staff worked to extend polling hours in counties where his support was strong. Cruz looked like he'd been hit by a truck. The hypocrisy was laid out in black and white with his own campaign data as evidence. "So," Senator Crockett said, closing the folder with a snap, "which is it? Were the voting methods that helped elect you to the Senate legitimate and secure, or are they the fraudulent security risks you claim they are today?" The silence in the room was deafening. Cruz opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He'd been caught in a contradiction using his own data, exposed by someone he'd tried to intimidate, humiliated by his own tactics. Crockett set the folder down and looked directly at Cruz. "Senator, you've interrupted me 6 times today, but your 7th attempt just proved my point better than any presentation I could have given. When politicians attack voting rights while relying on those same rights for their own elections, that's not constitutional principle. That's political hypocrisy." The room exploded in applause from the Democratic side. Even some Republicans looked uncomfortable with Cruz's exposure. The chairman called for order, but the damage was done. Cruz sat back in his chair, his usual smirk completely gone, replaced by the look of someone who just had his own strategy turned against him in the most public way possible. He tried to destroy a freshman congresswoman and instead had been systematically dismantled by his own tactics. The immediate aftermath of Crockett's takedown was electric. As the committee moved to recess, staffers were already pulling out their phones. The clip of Cruz's humiliation was hitting social media before the hearing had even officially ended. The speed of the digital reaction was unprecedented, even by modern political standards. Within 60 seconds of Crockett's "Senator, you had your 6 chances" line, video clips were being uploaded to multiple platforms simultaneously. Social media managers for political organizations had been watching the hearing live, and they moved with practiced efficiency to capitalize on the viral moment. The hashtag wars began immediately. Fracka Crockett Destroy Cruz rocketed to the top of trending topics, competing with 6 interruptions and saw respectful politics for dominance. Conservative accounts tried to push counter-narratives with hashtags like Market Cruz Fights Back and Constitutional Education, but they were quickly overwhelmed by the volume of content celebrating Crockett's performance. Political meme generators, both professional and amateur, worked at lightning speed to capture the essence of the confrontation. The image of Cruz's stunned face after being interrupted himself became instant digital currency, paired with captions ranging from serious political commentary to crude humor. GIF creators extracted key moments from the video feed, creating shareable content that would circulate for weeks. The professional political media moved almost as quickly as social media users. Cable news producers were cutting clips while the hearing was still in session, preparing segments for their evening shows. Political reporters were crafting headlines and opening paragraphs, trying to capture the significance of what they'd witnessed while the details were still fresh. Within minutes, hashtags were trending. Crockett Destroy Cruz rocketed to the top of social media feeds. 6 interruptions became a rallying cry for those frustrated with political grandstanding. The video clip of Crockett saying, "Senator, you've had your 6 chances," was being shared thousands of times per minute. The demographics of the social media response revealed interesting patterns about modern political engagement. Younger users, particularly those under 35, were sharing clips with commentary about generational change in politics. Older users focused more on the substantive policy questions Crockett had raised. Women across all age groups responded particularly strongly to seeing female politicians successfully stand up to male aggression. International observers began sharing the clips as well, with political commentators in other democracies using the e-exchange as an example of both the problems and potential solutions in modern democratic discourse. Parliamentary systems in other countries began examining whether similar dynamics existed in their own legislative proceedings. The media reaction was swift and brutal for Cruz. Political commentators who'd spent years watching his committee performances were calling this his worst defeat ever. The contrast was stark. Cruz, the seasoned constitutional lawyer, had been outmaneuvered by a freshman representative using nothing but facts and his own campaign data. Progressive groups seized on the moment immediately. Voting rights organizations were already cutting ads featuring Crockett's performance. Fundraising emails went out within hours using the confrontation to highlight the importance of protecting voting access. Democratic campaign committees saw donations spike as supporters rallied around someone who'd finally stood up to Cruz's bullying tactics. But the impact went far beyond just one bad day for Ted Cruz. The video became a masterclass in how to handle political intimidation. Law schools started using it as an example of effective cross-examination techniques. Political training programs added it to their curricula for handling hostile questioning. Communication experts analyzed every aspect of Crockett's performance, from her vocal tone to her body language. Students at universities across the country watched the clip in political science classes, studying how Crockett had maintained her composure under sustained attack. Debate teams used it to teach members how to handle aggressive opponents who tried to throw them off balance with interruptions and personal attacks. The video also became required viewing for women entering politics, female candidates, and their aide. Campaign managers studied how Crockett had refused to be intimidated by Cruz's traditional dominance tactics. Her performance became a template for how to respond when male politicians tried to use condescension and interruption as weapons. Professional development seminars for lawyers began incorporating the hearing into their training materials. Young attorneys learned from watching how Crockett had turned an adversarial situation to her advantage, using preparation and factual evidence to overcome procedural manipulation and personal attacks. Young politicians across the country reached out to Crockett's office, wanting to learn her tactics. Women in politics especially connected with her performance, seeing it as proof that preparation and principle could overcome bluster and intimidation. Her staff began receiving requests from political organizations wanting to book her for training sessions and strategy meetings. Congressional staff members from both parties quietly began studying the tactics she'd used, recognizing that the political landscape was changing. The old methods of intimidation and procedural manipulation were becoming less effective against a new generation of politicians who'd grown up watching political theater and understood how to counter it. The voting rights legislation itself gained new momentum from the hearing. Crockett's systematic destruction of Cruz's arguments had exposed the weakness of the opposition's position. Committee members who'd been on the fence found themselves swayed by her evidence-based approach. Cruz, meanwhile, tried to control the damage. His staff put out statements claiming he'd been making important constitutional points and that the media was distorting his performance. But the video spoke for itself. There was no spinning away 6 interruptions followed by a complete intellectual dismantling. Conservative media tried to defend Cruz, but even his usual allies seemed uncomfortable. Some right-wing commentators actually criticized his performance, saying he'd been out-prepared and had walked into a trap. The criticism from his own side was almost more damaging than attacks from progressives. The long-term implications were even more significant. Cruz's reputation as an unbeatable debater took a major hit. Future witnesses came to hearings better prepared for his tactics, knowing that someone had successfully turned his own methods against him. Crockett, on the other hand, saw her national profile skyrocket overnight. Speaking invitations poured in from across the country. Major news networks wanted interviews. Political organizations wanted her as a featured speaker. But perhaps most importantly, the confrontation changed the dynamics of committee hearings more broadly. Other senators and representatives started thinking twice before using aggressive interruption tactics, knowing they might face the same kind of systematic dismantling that Cruz had experienced. The video became a case study in political communications programs. Students analyzed how Crockett had maintained her composure under pressure, how she'd used Cruz's own data against him, and how she'd turned defensive moments into offensive opportunities. Voting rights advocates called it a turning point in the national conversation. For years, they'd watched politicians like Cruz dominate hearings through procedural manipulation and aggressive tactics. Crockett's performance showed that preparation, facts, and strategic thinking could overcome political theater. The aftermath also revealed something important about changing generational dynamics in politics. Crockett represented a new generation of politicians who'd grown up watching viral political moments, who understood how to communicate in an age of social media, and who weren't intimidated by the old power structures. Cruz's political future became a subject of speculation. Some analysts suggested the confrontation had damaged his brand permanently, especially among younger voters who saw him as a symbol of everything wrong with political discourse. Others argued that his base would rally around him, seeing the criticism as proof of media bias. But the numbers told a different story. Polling in Texas showed Cruz's approval ratings dropping, particularly among college-educated suburban voters who'd watched the hearing. His fundraising slowed and potential primary challengers started making noise about running against him. The committee eventually passed the voting rights legislation, with several Republicans citing Crockett's evidence in their explanations for switching their votes. The bill moved to the full chamber with much stronger support than anyone had anticipated before the hearing. The legislative victory was particularly sweet for voting rights advocates who'd watched similar bills die in committee before. This time, the combination of Crockett's thorough preparation and Cruz's spectacular overreach had created momentum that carried the legislation forward. Committee members who'd been undecided found themselves swayed not just by her evidence, but by the stark contrast between her professional presentation and Cruz's theatrical interruptions. The policy implications extended far beyond this single piece of legislation. Other voting rights bills that had been stalled in various committees suddenly found new life as legislators became more willing to engage with the evidence rather than dismiss it through procedural tactics. Crockett's systematic presentation had elevated the entire debate by forcing opponents to engage with facts rather than rely on political theater. State legislators across the country began referencing the hearing in their own debates about voting access. The federal legislation provided a template for state-level reforms, and Crockett's evidence became a roadmap for advocates working at every level of government. Her meticulous documentation of voter suppression tactics made it harder for politicians to deny that problems existed. For Crockett, the moment marked her arrival as a national political figure. But more than that, it established her as someone who could stand up to the most aggressive political operators and not just survive, but win. Committee assignments that had seemed routine before suddenly carried new weight as colleagues recognized her ability to handle high-pressure situations. The transformation of her role within Congress was immediate and significant. Senior Democratic members began seeking her input on strategy for other high-profile hearings. Her staff received requests to train other members on handling hostile questioning. What had started as a routine committee appearance had evolved into a masterclass in political combat that other politicians wanted to learn from. Her fundraising exploded overnight as small-dollar donors across the country contributed to support someone who'd finally stood up to Cruz's bullying tactics. Progressive organizations that had never heard of her before the hearing suddenly wanted her as a featured speaker at their events. The viral moment had transformed her from a freshman representative into a national political celebrity. The story of 6 interruptions and 1 devastating response became more than just a viral political moment. It became a symbol of how preparation, principle, and courage could overcome political bullying. It showed that the old tactics of intimidation and procedural manipulation could be defeated by someone willing to stand their ground and fight back with facts. The broader implications for American political discourse were significant and lasting. For years, committee hearings had devolved into theatrical performances where the loudest, most aggressive voices dominated the conversation. Substantive policy discussions were regularly derailed by politicians who understood that viral moments and cable news clips were more valuable than actual legislative work. Crockett's performance offered a different model, one where preparation trumped theater, where facts mattered more than sound bites, where respectful but firm push back could defeat bullying tactics. Political scientists began studying the hearing as an example of how democratic discourse could be elevated rather than degraded by skilled participants who understood both the rules and the stakes. The impact on future committee hearings was immediate and measurable. Politicians who'd previously relied on Cruz-style interruption tactics found themselves facing opponents who'd studied Crockett's methods and were prepared to push back. The dynamic shifted from aggressive questioners dominating passive witnesses to more balanced exchanges where evidence and argument carried more weight than volume in theatrics. Training programs for congressional staff began incorporating the hearing into their curricula. New members of Congress and their teams studied the exchange as an example of how to handle hostile questioning while maintaining focus on substantive issues. Law schools added it to courses on advocacy and cross-examination, showing students how courtroom skills could translate to political settings. The international reaction was equally significant. Democratic institutions around the world had been struggling with similar problems. How to maintain substantive policy discussions in an era of increasing political polarization and media-driven theater. Crockett's performance became a case study in parliamentary systems across multiple countries, showing how individual politicians could elevate discourse through preparation and principled pushback. Academic research on political communication began examining what they called the Crockett effect, the ways that well-prepared fact-based responses could shift power dynamics in political settings. Communication scholars analyzed every aspect of her performance, from her vocal patterns to her use of documentary evidence, creating frameworks that other politicians could adapt to their own situations. In the end, Ted Cruz learned a lesson that many political bullies have to learn eventually. There's always someone smarter, better prepared, and more principled waiting to expose your tactics. For Jasmine Crockett, it was proof that sometimes the best defense is a perfectly executed offense. The hearing ended, but the impact continued to ripple through American politics. And somewhere in Texas, voters were taking note of which politicians could handle themselves under pressure and which ones crumbled when their own tactics were used against them. The transformation of political discourse didn't happen overnight, but the seeds were planted in that committee room. Future political historians would mark this hearing as a turning point. The moment when a new generation of politicians showed they wouldn't be intimidated by the old guard's tactics and when preparation and principle proved more powerful than bluster and theater. The cultural impact extended far beyond the immediate political sphere. Business schools began incorporating the hearing into leadership training programs, using it as a case study in how to maintain composure under pressure while effectively responding to aggressive tactics. Corporate executives and their communications teams studied Crockett's methods for handling hostile questioning during earnings calls and shareholder meetings. Educational institutions at every level began examining the confrontation as an example of effective advocacy and argumentation. High school debate teams watched the clips to learn about preparation strategies and tactical responses to interruption-based attacks. College communication programs used the hearing to teach students about the importance of factual preparation in combating rhetorical manipulation. The legal profession took particular notice of Crockett's performance, recognizing the way she had successfully translated courtroom advocacy skills into the political arena. Bar associations began organizing continuing education seminars that analyzed her techniques, particularly her ability to maintain focus on substantive issues while effectively countering procedural attacks. International observers and democratic institutions in other countries began studying the hearing as an example of both the problems and potential solutions in modern democratic discourse. Parliamentary systems in multiple nations examined whether similar dynamics existed in their own legislative proceedings and what lessons could be learned from Crockett's approach. The psychology of the confrontation became a subject of academic study in multiple disciplines. Political scientists analyzed the power dynamics involved in interruption-based tactics and evidence-based responses. Communication researchers examined the verbal and nonverbal elements that made Crockett's performance so effective. Psychology department studied the emotional regulation techniques that allowed her to maintain composure under sustained pressure. Women's leadership organizations across the country began using clips from the hearing in their training programs, showing how preparation and principled pushback could overcome traditional intimidation tactics. The confrontation became a symbol of changing power dynamics in professional settings, demonstrating that aggressive behavior was no longer guaranteed to overwhelm careful preparation and factual argumentation. The hearing also had significant implications for media literacy education. Educators began using the confrontation to teach students how to identify the difference between substantive argument and theatrical performance, how to recognize manipulation tactics disguised as legitimate procedure, and how to evaluate the quality of evidence presented in political discussions. Social media platforms themselves began studying the viral spread of the hearing clips as an example of how authentic moments of political accountability could organically generate massive engagement. The rapid spread of the content provided insights into what types of political content resonated most strongly with different demographic groups and why certain moments achieved viral status while others did not. Thanks for watching this incredible political showdown. If you want to see more moments like this where political bullies get exactly what they deserve, smash that like button and subscribe to never miss the latest congressional drama. And let us know in the comments, what do you think about Crockett's takedown of Cruz? Was this the moment that changed everything? We'll see you in the next video where we break down the political aftermath and what this means for both of their careers going forward.